Pokerbots had instructor.
Awesome, yeah. And today we'll be talking about poker bots and just thinking strategically about poker bots. So just to give a quick intro to what poker is, we're going to be talking about no limit Texas Hold'em, the most popular variant of poker, and also just like the one that is just played across the board. And it's basically when you say poker, it's what people think about. The objective of poker bots is pretty simple: earn as many chips as possible, or if you're playing at a casino, get as much money as possible. And the premise is this: each player will receive two secret cards called their full cards, and then they will bet into a pot of several rounds, and whoever has the best hand at the end will win the pot. The structure of a betting round is that the first player can bet nothing, or check, called check, or bet any amount between the big blind, which is the smallest bet size, and the number of chips they have remaining, which is all inning. And if they check, they just pass it on to the next player, yada, yada, yada. If they bet, the next player has options to fold, which means not call the bet. Call just means match the amount, and raise, which means re-raise that amount and then make it even higher to call. This goes around and around and around until every single player has acted. Hand strength is determined by the best 5-card poker hand. So each person is dealt 2 secret cards or whole cards, and then 5 community cards are dealt out. First 3 come out called the flop, then the turn comes out, which is 1 card. Finally, the last card comes the river. So the structure of the game is each person is dealt 2 cards, the whole cards, and there's a round of betting. This is called pre-flop because it's before the flop, before cards have come out. And to the left of the big blind is the first to act. So in poker, there's 3 main positions. There's dealer, small blind, and big blind. In order, it's dealer, then to the left of dealer is small blind, and to the left of the small blind is the big blind. And pre-flop, the first person to act is the person left of the big blind. And then it goes around like a normal betting round. And then after all action is done, the flop comes out. So 3 community cards are dealt. And now to the left of the dealer starts. So the small blind starts the action. This is different than pre-flop, which is to the left of the big blind starts the action. And then there's a betting round. And once everything is done, the turn card comes out, which is the 4th card, betting round. Then the river card, the last card comes out. And again, betting round. And at the end, if there are still multiple players in the pot, it goes to settlement or showdown, where everyone flips over their cards and whoever has better cards takes the money. So to talk a little bit more, there's in the card rankings are pretty self-explanatory. Ace is the high card and 2 is the lowest card. And it goes ace is higher than king, which is higher than queen, yada, yada, yada. And there's 4 suits: clubs, hearts, spades, and diamonds. There is no relation between like one suit being better than the other suits. There's just 4 suits. So because there are 13 different cards and 4 different suits, each standard deck of poker has 52 cards, no jokers. In terms of hand strength, these are like the different types of 5-card hands you can make. 5-card hands you can make. So even before 1 pair, if you just like have 5 cards that kind of have no relation to each other, what you have is called high card, which is like what's the highest card you have in your hand. Often high cards will come down to ace, but sometimes you can win with like a queen high. And then we look at pairs. So there's 1 pair, then what's better than 1 pair? 2 pairs. And after 2 pair, there's 3 of a kind, which is 3 of the same thing. Then straight, which is 5 cards in a row. Flush, which is 5 cards of the same suit. Then full house, which is both a straight and, which is both a 3 of a kind and a pair. And then 4 of a kind, straight flush, and royal flush. A straight flush is both a straight and a flush. And a royal flush is specifically ace through 10 of one of the suits. That is a straight flush. So what we really actually care about is like the bottom half of this, because royal flushes, straight flushes, and all these really, really like, I guess, best hands are really, really rare. And often like 1 pair is the hand that just wins most of the time. So we really just care about like 1 pair, 2 pair, even some 3 of a kinds. And then we look for flushes or straights, but we don't really like expect to get them very often. So let's look at some examples of like poker boards and try to figure out basically like what's on the board. So if we look here, we can see that we have, in my hand, I have Jack Queen and I have Jack Queen suited. They're of the same suit. So I'm going to look and I'm like, okay, I have a pair of 2s because there's a pair of 2s on the board, but I also have ace, king, queen, Jack 10, which is a straight. So my best 5-card hand I can make is a straight ace through 10. In this case, I have a pair of 2s again on the board, and I have ace king in my hand. So I have a pair of kings and an ace. So my best 5-card hand here would be ace, king, king, 2, 2 as 2 pair. This one's a little bit more confusing because there's a pair of kings, a pair of 2s, and a pair of 3s. So we can't really have 3 pair, right? Because like 3 pair is more than 5 cards. So instead, our best hand would be a pair of kings, a pair of threes, and the 10, which is, again, 2 pair. No 3 pair allowed. And finally here, this one's pretty obvious, but if you just look at them, there's 5 cards that are of the same color, so you have a flush. So what we talked about are like hand boards and like how stuff could be played out. But what's a really important question is like, okay, what do we want to be holding in our own hand? What hole cards are we looking for? What are the good hands to play, basically? So let's like look through these and think of the examples, right? If I have 2 king here, they're offsuit, so they can't really make flushes. A king is really high, so that's good, but like 2 is kind of low, which is bad, and it kind of just makes the 2 useless. So what I'm really looking at here is kind of just a king. And I don't want to, each person has dealt 2 hole cards, right? I don't want to be playing with just one of my cards when my other card is useless. So this is why 2 king offsuit is not a good hand. If we change that 2 to an ace of the same suit, though, this hand becomes way, way, way better. That's because 1, ace is the highest card. 2, they're suited, which means you have like much more higher flush potential. 2, they're connected. So like ace, 2, 3, 4, 5 is a straight. One thing to note is that straights don't wrap around ace. They have to either start with ace or end with ace if you're going through there. So like 10 through ace is a straight and ace through 5 is a straight, but queen through 3 is not a straight. But yeah, so for ace 2, I have like a lot of potential optionality with straights, with flushes. The ace is really high. My 2 just became way more useful. So this is a good hand to play. The ace counts as the, okay, there you go. Yeah. From here, ace 10, when we look at ace 10, we look at like the ace, and the ace is a high card. We look at the 10, and the 10 is pretty high. And sure, there's like some potential like jack, queen, king comes out, but what we really care about here is just like, it's usually pairs that come out. And if I get a pair of aces or a pair of 10s, it's like going to be higher than probably the other cards on the board. So ace 10 here is a good hand. Pocket 3s. So if pocket 3s means that you have like 2, you get dealt a pair of 3s in your hand. And the reason why this hand is really good is it's called a made hand. And what that means is that like I already have a pair in my hand, right? If I have like the previous hand of ace 10, sure, it like has optionality to play, but I don't have anything. A pair of 3s is already better than ace 10. So any sort of like made hand, like a pocket pair, is a good hand to play. This hand, so 2, 3. So they are connected, which means like they're one away from each other. So that you can kind of make a straight. But 2, 3 is like, they're like the lowest cards, right? Like the only thing it's really going for is it's connected. A fun fact is that 2, 3 is the hand statistically that poker players have lost the most money on. And I can say from personal experience, I've also lost a good amount of money on 2, 3 because you just like think you have something, but most often you someone else has something better, right? If I have a pair of 2s, that's like a lowest pair. If anyone has any other pair, they're beating me. And that's why like if you can play 2, 3, but then you lose a lot of money often. So this is why 2, 3 is also a bad hand. Finally, 5, 6. So again, these are like kind of low, but what it's going for here is like optionality, right? 5, 6, they're connected and they're suited. So that means like if more clubs come out, we'd be really, really happy. If like 7, 8 came out, we're like, oh, wow, we're almost to a straight. And the other thing about 5, 6 is let's say the board comes out like so the flop comes out ace, king, 3, like then we know we kind of just have a bad hand here and we can just throw it away. So we know if we have a good hand and then we have a lot of potential optionality. So that's why 5, 6 here is pretty good. So I'm going to pass it off to Haija to explain what a good hand bot kind of looks like.
Yeah, thanks, Andy. So now what you see on the screen is a code snippet in which we automate a decision-making process to determine whether the hand we have is good or bad. And this exemplifies kind of the beauty behind a poker bot because now we have some sort of way to automate the decision-making process. And what you see on the screen is a function called isGoodHand. And if you're not too familiar with programming, you can ignore all the syntax and just focus on like the main ideas. So this is written in Python, and we have a function that takes in cards as input, and it's going to return true or false. And true is going to identify our pair of cards as a good hand, and false will signify that our current hand is not good. So essentially, when we take in cards, we're going to access the first card and the second card. And in this case, I'm representing each card as two string characters, where one represents the suit of the card, and then another represents what rank the card is. So the first um, hand we're going to look at is see if we can identify a pair. So we compare the ranks of card one and card two using the first if statement. And if they're equal, then we'll return true because we have identified a pair. If we don't have a pair, we'll look for a potential flush by comparing the suit of the two cards. And we do that in our second else if statement. And if the two suits are equal, we'll also return true in this case. And otherwise, we'll just return false, signifying that our hand isn't good and we might perform um, some action given whether we have a good hand or a bad hand. If we have a bad hand, we might decide to fold. And the true or false flag helps us make that decision. So this was a very simple example of what you can do in the poker playing process with a bot, and you can add a lot more ideas on top of this to make more complex strategies and identify different cards. So I'm going to hand it back to Andy to talk more about what strategies we can use to play poker.
Yeah. One other thing that's great about bots is that they're generally rational. They just like listen to what you tell them to do. And I don't know about other people, but when I play poker, I sometimes get irrational. I get tilted and I'm like, okay, I have a good hand. I can win at any cost. And you kind of just go through it and you make mistakes because of that. And bots are consistent. They do what you tell them to do because there's no like thinking or no other factors to consider. So what does like good poker strategy look like? Well, the hands we were looking at, we can kind of classify into different things. So there's suited connectors, which are both like suited and connected. So 5-6, for example, because they're suited, they're both clubs, and they're connected because 5 is right next to 6. Pocket pairs because they're good as made hands, and like high cards just because they're like higher than anything else. So what we really want to do is like play our good hands and not play our bad hands. I know it's fun to play something like 2 king because like what if I hit the king, right? But as much fun as that is, it doesn't make you money. And if we're trying to play good poker, we're trying to basically maximize like our chance of making money. So we want to fold early with our bad hands to cut our losses and play our good hands. And this play style naturally comes with the name of tight aggressive. So what tight means is that you want to play like not a lot of hands. You want to play pretty tight. You don't want to be like, oh, loosey goosey is the term where you just like throw away your money and just throw money into the pot. But when you do play a hand, you really, really want to play it aggressively. You want to build the pot when you have a good hand because you have a good hand. You want to get into these big pots with better hands than the other people because that's where you make the most money in poker. More quantitatively, like you're probably only playing 20% of the hands you get. I've played poker where like I just sat there all night and I played maybe like 2 hands and I folded them really early because I wasn't getting good cards. And that leads to this like very like unfortunate thing that good poker is often super boring because you just kind of sit there and wait for good hands. So the natural question is, okay, let's say you get dealt a good hand. How do you play it? So first, we've got to figure out, like, again, what is a good hand? This thing on the left is called a hand range. And it's basically like the range of hands that you're willing to play. It's technically a probability distribution, but we don't really need to get into that. What it really means is that if you see one of the things in blues, they're pretty good. And you should open them, as in you should play them. And what opening means is that pre-flop, everyone is dealt cards, and everyone has the option to raise, call, or fold. And what call means is you have to like call the big blind amount. So say the small blind is 1 chip, the big blind would be 2 chips. You have to call that 2 chip amount. The thing about this is that when you call the 2 chip amount, it's called limping. And this is bad because it shows weakness. And what good poker players will often do is like raise you an obscene amount, like maybe like 20 chips to see what you do. because then you're forced to play a bigger pot with a worse hand because you lint. So we use the term opening when you raise pre-flop, which is standard size 3x. So like if the small blind is 1 and the big blind is 2, if I wanted to play that hand, I would raise to 6 or I would just fold. Typically, with a 6 people at a table, only 2 to 3 go into a hand, and it's usually 2. And most of the time, there's a lot of folds pre-flop, and sometimes it just folds to the big blind, and they just take the small blind amount because no one has good cards to play. So let's say like pre-flop happened, everything was done, and then now it's like, okay, what do we play post-flop? And this is like really advanced, and there's a lot of interesting strategies to go through here. But I think the best way I thought about it was like really just like think about your hand and what you have. So here's like a brief checklist of like, okay, what's my absolute hand strength? If I have a royal flush, I'm just gonna like win. I just have the best hand, you know? Likewise, sometimes with like if I have top pair, sometimes I just like know I'm gonna win because I just don't think they have anything better. But what matters more is like, what is my relative hand strength? Like, is my hand better than what they have, right? Maybe I have ace high, but the way they're playing makes me feel like they have 10 high, and ace high beats 10 high. And that's what matters. It doesn't matter that it's only an ace. What matters is it beats the other person. So then it's like, okay, what does my opponent have? And the natural question there is like, what makes sense for them to have? And then it's this big process of figuring out, okay, what could they have here? And can I beat them with what I have? And if I can beat them, there's this thing in poker that's basically just like extracting the most value out of someone. And it's like, okay, if I'm beating someone, I want to like squeeze out the most money out of them because I'm trying to like build up my own bankroll. And alternatively, are they bluffing? And is my hand good enough to call their bluff? Because if we can figure out they're bluffing, usually my hand is good enough to call, and I can exploit them in that way too. So this is a lot of stuff to consider, and it feels very like soft, right? It feels like, okay, I'm like thinking about it, but I don't really know. So we have to try to approach this a little bit more quantitatively. So approaching poker quantitatively. I claim that for any state in poker, there's some probability of winning. This probability exists, but like I don't have any good metric of it. But like, of course, the probability exists out there. Like you sample all the possible hands that come out, all the possible hands that my opponent could have, and I have some probability of winning. And it depends on how my opponent is playing. We can ignore that, and we can just say that this probability is between 0 and 1. So I want to basically make actions that are positive expected value, because over time, if my actions are positive expected value, then I will be making money, like in the long run. So what I'm going to do is like calculate my expected value. So P is my probability of winning. And if I win like everything in the pot. So my pot total. And if I lose, so I have a 1 minus T chance of losing, I'm basically giving up my continue cost, or like the amount of money I'm putting in to continue to be in the pot. There's this notion in poker that any money is already in the pot is called dead money, which means that we don't consider like, okay, I already put 10 bucks in, I can't put another 10 in. It doesn't matter, that 10 is already in there. And now the question is, can I get that 10 back? So that's why we only consider continue cost. And we want this expected value to be positive, right? Because we want to be making money. We want to make like actions that are good and benefit us. So if we separate out and solve P, basically we say that we want, if the probability of winning is greater than the continue cost over the pot total plus continue cost, aka the pot odds, then we should stay in the game. So here's a quick exercise, right? Here I have 2, king, 10, 2 on the board, and I have jack, queen in my hand. So when I have jack, queen in my hand, I have 4 to a straight, right? I have 10, jack, queen, king. So I'm really looking for an ace or a 9. If my opponent bets 250, so from 40 to 50, the question is, do I have the odds to call? So here, the pot odds required are, the pot total right now is 90, and I need to pay 10 to continue. So my pot odds are 10 over 90 plus 10, or 10% basically. So if the probability that I win is greater than 10%, then I should call. So now the question is, okay, now what's the probability that I win? This is pretty hard to actually know like definitively, but we can use some heuristics to figure that out. So oftentimes we are like looking for cards that complete our hand. If we go back to our example before, we're looking for aces and 9s because an ace or a 9 would make a straight. And the thing about this is that if we like get the ace or 9, we're almost positive that we have a better hand than the other person. And that means that our probability of winning becomes like 100%. So what we're really looking for is like how many aces and 9s can come out. So the strategy to do this is we're going to count the number of cards that complete our hand, which are outs. And then we're going to basically say that in a poker deck, there's only 50 cards and there's always 50 cards. So that means any card that comes out in poker has a roughly 2% chance of coming out. It's roughly because this is an assumption, but it's good enough. And that means that on each like potential card to be revealed, so the turn or the river, I have a 2% chance of hitting each out. And this would be a probability of winning. So that's a little bit confusing, and we can delve into the example here. So here, again, I'm looking for an ace or a 9. So how many aces are there in the deck? There's 4 aces in the deck. And how many 9s there are there? There's 4 9s in the deck. So in total, there's 8 possible cards that complete my hand. And that means I have 8 outs. So my probability of completing the hand is going to be 16%, because again, it's like 8 over 50 is roughly 16%. So the probability that I win, I'm saying, is 16%, which is greater than my pot odds of 0.1 or 10%. So since it's greater, we should call. And the idea is, okay, maybe like a 2 comes out again and I don't hit it. That's okay, because over time, in expectation, I should be getting enough of these that means that I will be making money in this situation over time. So that's like a quick introduction to pot odds, and I'm going to pass it off to Haija again to code it up and show you how it actually looks.
Yeah, so again, we can now actually translate the theoretical ideas about pot odds that Andy introduced into actual code and see how we can automate the decision of which action we ought to take. So right now on the screen, we have this function called get action pot, and essentially we take in as input um, our cards, and we're going to calculate our pot odds. And based off of our probability of winning and the pot odds, we're going to return a given action for our bot to perform. So pot odds is calculated, as Andy introduced earlier, as the continued cost over the total pot plus the continued cost. And we calculate P by calling a get probability function. So this is an example of how in our current function, we can utilize another function to calculate some entity or value that we want. And that's another benefit, not necessarily benefit, but another unique point of a Pokerbot is that we can define these functions to automate the entire process and make these calculations really quickly. So once we get our probability of winning, we can use some logic to determine whether we should call or fold. So if our probability of winning is greater than pot odds, then we have a positive expected value and we can call. So we return the string call. And actually here you can add more logic on top of this to determine whether we should raise or call, and add some randomness into your strategy so that keeps your opponent on their toes. Otherwise, if our probability of winning is less than pot odds, then we're going to return fold, as we have determined it's not a good idea for us to continue playing. So yeah, so as you can see from the previous code example, in this code example, Pokerbot essentially allows us to really take advantage of being able to make these calculations and use logic to perform certain actions. And there's a lot of additional strategies that can be built on top of this snippet of code. And Andy's going to go further into some advanced strategies in poker.
Awesome. Thanks, Haija. Yeah, so I'm going to get into a little bit more advanced stuff. Feel free to hop in if you're confused, or feel free to send questions in the chat. So just a quick recap of the questions we're asking ourselves. I've highlighted the third and fourth question. So what do I think my opponent has, and what makes sense for him or her to have? And what we're trying to do is basically like think about what my opponent can have, right? Because it's like think about it. If I know what you have in your hand, I can always beat you because I know I have a better hand than you. So we really want to do a good job of basically narrowing down, okay, what is my opponent's range? So this to the right is like a standard pre-flop open range for like 1C. And the thing about it is like, okay, if I'm a good poker player, I know this pre-flop open range. But if Hydra's also a good poker player, she would also know this range, right? So like, let's say Hydra and I are playing and she decides to put money into the pot, so she opens. Well, obviously I will not think that she has 2-7 off, because 2-7 off is like the worst hand, and she's not going to do that if she's like a rational person who's trying to make money. So if this play progresses, you can kind of narrow down your opponent's range. There's like some videos on YouTube of like pro poker players being like, you have aces or kings, or you have king nine, just like having this magical read. Well, I hate to break it to you, but it's not as magical as it seems. It's basically just narrowing down your opponent's range to the point where you narrow it down to like one possible hand. And if it's one possible hand, then you just say, okay, you have that, or you're just entirely bluffing. So an example is like, if I am playing and all I'm doing is raising and raising and raising and always raising, and this is pre-flop, yeah, it makes sense if I have like aces or kings or queens, or maybe even like ace king or something like that. So the question now is like, how do we consider our own range and our opponent's own range? There's this quote from Daniel Negreanu, which I think is super funny, which is, everything at the poker table conveys information. You should watch his masterclass ad. It's hilarious, but it does make sense, right? Like everything you do can be used to update your own range and update your opponent's range. Because if you're doing this, the other person is also doing this, right? It's this big process of trying to figure out each other out. And if you figure something out from the other person, you want to act on that belief. You want to say, okay, that doesn't make sense for you to like make these types of bets and have that type of hand here. I just like don't think you have it. Let me call your bluff. And maybe they're bluffing. Other times, like you can be like, okay, I don't really know what you have, but I know that you have something that's better than me. And that's good information too, because that means my hand, like the only way I will win is if I bluff. And sometimes, or most of the time, if I get to that point, I'm just going to fold because their entire range beats me, which means that I just have a worse hand compared to them. This is more like the way I'm talking about it is much more of an art than a science. It's like, okay, let's like try to figure it out. Let's like think about it. But this can be applied quantitatively. In fact, the winner of Pokerbots from 2020, they had a range exploiting Pokerbot. It was super exploitative. They basically just calculated their opponent's range and their opponent's play styles, and basically perfectly tailored their play style to be more tight aggressive than the other opponents' play styles, and that was just really, really good. Obviously, they did really well because they won, but yeah, this is how ranges are a really, really powerful concept. I want to add one last thing about remaining balanced. You hear this term thrown around a lot. What it really means is like, okay, if I have aces, and every time I have aces, I raise 10x, and I always just continue raising. Well, after a while, if I do that, people will think that I have aces and just fold. So I want to make sure that like my play style doesn't reveal too much about like the hands that I have. I also want to touch on a little bit more about advanced poker bots. So Lebradas and Plurbius have been the two most recent advancements in poker AI by this guy named Noam Brown. He's currently at Facebook AI, and he did his entire PhD on this kind of stuff. And it uses this advanced strategy called counterfactual regret minimization. This is absolutely atrocious to implement. It's super, super buggy. When you run into a bug, you don't even know if it's like you're doing it wrong, or it's just really, really, really hard to implement. The strategy is basically, I'm going to play out the entire game and try every single possibility. So let's say like in this spot, I'm going to try raising to 2, raising to 5, raising to 10, just raising different amounts and seeing what happens. And each time that happens, I'm going to see how much regret I have, right? So if I won a bunch of money, I'm going to have negative regret. I'm going to be happy. Yeah, I won a bunch of money. And if I lose a lot of money, I'm going to have a lot of regret. And the idea is that you continue doing this and adjusting strategies, and you playing against each other until you minimize the amount of regret, which in other words is saying, okay, I'm making the moves that like have high expected value or low chance of like losing me money. This took, I think, 16,000 CPU cores to train, and it took an obscene amount of time to train. He used like all of Facebook's power for a while. It was pretty impressive to say the least. And Lebradas, a few years ago, they set up a $200,000 poker tournament where they invited a bunch of top professionals to play against Lebradas. And even afterwards, they gave the hands that Lebradas played and like told them like this is like how they played in these spots. And these poker pros kind of just like toiled over and kind of researched how Lebradas was playing, and they still couldn't beat Lebradas over time. So this just goes to show that like a lot of these new AIs for poker are becoming what Noam likes to call superhuman, which is like being able to beat even human, like the best of the human players. Noam Brown is also a guest lecturer for Pokerbots, and he swings by for our last lecture. It was really great to see him. That brings us to the end of our presentation. I hope you guys learned a little bit about poker, a little bit about bot building, and have some sort of interest to play. And we're happy to take any sort of questions you have.